As you guys may have noticed, I kind of sort of have an obsession with the Resident Evil series. One that may or may not cross the line into creepy territory, but even a uber fan like myself needs a little vacation every now and then. I mean, you can't just play RE all the time, and what better genre to cleanse the palate of Resident Evil than the Resident Evil clone? Yep, believe it or not, Capcom was not the only company to notice that survival horror games stood a solid chance of making a few bucks. Of course, there would be franchises that use survival horror as a jumping off point to form their own genres, but we're not talking about those today. Nope, instead we're looking at a game that can't wear its love for RE on its sleeve because RE is its sleeve. Carrier hit Japanese Dreamcast not even a month after Resident Evil Code Veronica and was developed by Jaleco, a company I had only really known as the guys who made the generally okay Earth Defense Force on the SNES. And before you get your hopes up, no, not that one. Well, I'm not one to judge a book by its cover, or in this sense, a game by its developer, so can Carrier take the torch from Capcom and keep the fires of survival horror burning? Well, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
Lieutenant Manning, what is that?
It's nothing. It's just part of my stuff. Who's in the picture?
Alright, so let's start out with a not-so-secret secret about myself. I am not one of those people who think survival horror games have to necessarily have a cheesy B-movie plot. I mean, take a look at the first and second RE games. Giant corporation with military contracts carries out secret experiments with the goal of developing a viral weapon. Not exactly what I would call a page out of science fiction. And sure, you may point at specifics that muddy the waters a bit, but as a setup, Capcom pretty much hit the nail on the head. So when holding Carrier up to the games it means to emulate, something I will be doing a lot in this video, how does it, well, hold up? As far as general scene setting goes, I would say Carrier's plot hits all the right points. The intro sets up a world that's been in the grips of a global resource shortage, something that isn't too far outside the realm of possibility in our own modern world. And with limited resources comes the all-too-familiar military conflict. In some kind of odd tribal move, the North and South hemispheres team up against each other, and since they're the ones with a less advantageous position economically speaking, the South resorts to guerrilla warfare-style tactics and terrorism. This red versus blue conflict gets so bad that the North, or as they like to be called, the NTA, builds a massive technologically advanced aircraft carrier.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
With its inaugural mission being the destruction of a terrorist cell in Colombia. Being the biggest, baddest war machine on Earth, the Heimdall completes Operation Hurricane with ease, but on its way back is tasked with picking up an ancient organism named Ark, and shortly after went radio silent. At first you play as Jack, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, all-American beefcake who's part of the NTA's Spark unit, and yes, they couldn't even have their acronym start with a different letter than stars. But anyways, your unit's been sent in to investigate the situation, and for some reason the ship's guns shoot your chopper down upon approach. Okay, so there'll be no points awarded for originality here, but to be fair, you can ignore the rest of the story. The real intrigue has to do with the political atmosphere of this world, and finding out just how the Ark organism has infected the ship. Through talking to the survivors, there's scattered rumors of spies working for the South, and a couple of red herrings to pay attention to, and for a while I was pretty damn interested in clearing this all up. Our boy Jack is the only option at first, but after clearing the game you get access to his teammate Jessifer, which I'm positive is a name no human being has ever had in the history of humanity. Which really isn't a game changer. I mean, the main story essentially screams a few of the future plot twists at you, but if you've done a good job collecting ammo as Jack, have fun in your second scenario because those ammo drops do not replenish between games. Okay, so the setup is pretty good admittedly, so that means the story must get high marks, right? Well, not exactly.
Hey, what happened?
That bastard.
Hey, get it together. What happened?
The story, as it exists on paper, is relatively interesting. The only problem is the game's method by which it's told. Yes, those of you who grew up with the Dreamcast probably know exactly where I'm headed. This game, like most games in the console's library, has some of the worst voice acting I have ever come across in all my years. Seriously, every single line in this game is delivered in the most robotic, poorly read, and underacted way imaginable.
What the hell's going on? Leonard was... By that?
which sort of changes the appeal a bit and very well might make it a little more positive. You see, Carrier is the video game equivalent of enjoying a nice episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. You don't so much play this game to experience its story, you suffer through it to laugh at that one part where they reused Jack screaming Colonel a whopping 3 times in less than a minute.
Colonel!
The partitions are going to close. Hurry! Don't make my death meaningless.
Colonel! Colonel!
I know the RE series always gets shit for its B-movie tier script, but those of you who make that argument have absolutely no idea what it really means until you dive into Carrier. That being said, I can't really tell you whether or not I enjoyed my time with this story. I think honestly it just depends on what you're into. For me, the silliness of the voice acting and dumb character drama kept getting in the way of a plot I was pretty interested in. But if you enjoy cringeworthy dialogue and voice acting worthy of a #1 spot in any top 10 list, well, may I introduce you to your new holy grail.
This is critical damage incoming.
Alright, so let's get this out of the way right up front. Carrier has the shitty job of having to directly compete with Resident Evil Code Veronica, not only due to this being a blatant RE clone, but they also came out within months of each other. As some of you may know, I think CV is one of the finest classic RE games, but I promise we'll be judging this bad boy on its own merits. Now, I can't promise I won't make a few comparisons here or there, but what Carrier does right and wrong mostly are kind of specific to the game alone, so don't worry, it will be getting a fair shake here. Before we start though, we have to address the whole RE clone thing. If I'm being honest, it feels a bit weird using that term. I mean, RE started survival horror, so wouldn't it be more accurate to say Carrier is a survival horror game? And while it definitely counts as survival horror in my ridiculously, universally known rigid standards, it just screams clone to me in nearly every aspect of its gameplay. Just like how the term Doom clone eventually broadened to first-person shooter as games turned away from Doom's core design, RE clones eventually became survival horror games as they started to find their own structure within the RE standards. All that being said, I'm actually pretty impressed at how much Carrier did to set itself apart from its genetic origin point. And you know, it just hit me, I've been jawing on about clones before even describing the actual gameplay to you, so let's remedy that right now. Carrier takes RE's specific brand of survival horror and runs full speed with it. Your character uses tank controls, readying your weapon is done with R, and there's a bit of an emphasis on conserving health items and ammunition. Exploring your surroundings will make up about 95% of the gameplay, and key items used to open new areas will almost always be locked behind a puzzle of some sort. As you might expect, backtracking plays a huge part in exploration, which would be a problem given the huge nature of the Heimdall, but Jalico made sure that you're almost always confined to one floor of the ship at a time. Each floor seems to gradually increase in complexity, and by the middle of the game you'll be checking your map every few rooms to make sure you're on the right path. I think this could have been fixed by including more memorable connecting areas in between major locations, but with the setting, I don't think much more could have been done. Maybe a smaller overall map could have helped, but honestly, it wasn't too much of an issue. It was just a bit annoying having to keep bringing up the map because the narrow connecting hallway you're currently navigating looks almost exactly like the one you just left. Overall, I'd say item placement, backtracking, and map layout are all pretty okay in survival horror terms, and might even scratch that itch that comes with a lack of games in the genre to actually play. But moving your character around is one of the areas where Carrier totally misses the mark. Either your character's run speed or the size of the environment needs to be tweaked heavily because it's nearly impossible to make a turn in this game without stopping your run and adjusting. This is something that gets very annoying when running away from enemies, which, thanks to the tight 90-degree laden hallways, is rarely an option here. I'd say throughout this playthrough I killed about 90% of the enemies in the game, and if you'll remember my previous incoherent rants on the subject, being able to choose whether or not to engage in combat is a huge part of what makes the genre so interesting. Sure, it's fun managing your inventory, finding solutions to puzzles, and remembering your environmental layout, but planning which foes to down and which foes to dodge is what draws me to these games. This kind of setup really gives me a feeling of mastery over a game when I've successfully mapped a route to my objective, only clearing out areas that don't allow for nimble maneuvering. Sadly, Carrier does lack this feeling, but it does some interesting things with the genre's traditional combat which may or may not make up for it. Much like what you're used to, Carrier will have you using a shoulder button to ready your weapon, another to fire it, and this will lock you in place, leaving your directional buttons to adjust your aim up, down, left, or right. But unlike what you're used to, your aim won't be returned to center once you let go of a vertical direction. Oddly enough, this was the first thing that really jumped out at me as kind of interesting when I first sampled the game in a Dreamcast magazine demo disc. I mean, it seemed like a very small touch, but this kind of gives you the feeling of having more control over combat, which is kind of nice. And if you're asking me, that was a masterfully done segue into the game's combat, which does show a bit of ambition from the devs. There have been all kinds of additions made here, and mostly they all work pretty damn well. First off, there's a quick change function mapped to the L trigger that cycles through your weapons, which pairs perfectly with the ability to use timed explosives. These things work like any other weapon, but get set on the ground and go off a few seconds after you've set them, whether or not you're in range of your own blast. Not only is this a pretty good option in combat if you're in the right scenario, but they're also used in exploration by taking out certain hazards and clearing the arc plant growth. Now, those of you who know me are probably expecting me to railroad the game for ruining its immersion by having on-screen inventory graphics, but like I'll get into later, this kind of just plays into the arcadey nature of the Dreamcast. Plus, the feature made the game a little more functional, so we're gonna let it slide this time. When using your more traditional projectile-based options, you'll notice you have the ability to aim at specific targets, letting you accurately line up headshots or blow limbs off the plant zombie things infesting the ship. I kind of like this addition as far as gameplay goes, and I'm sure some of you will be able to work out a strategy of just taking a zombie's arms out and passing by, but I stuck with good old-fashioned American headshots the whole time. The only thing I didn't like was this big colorful reticle that shows up so you know exactly what you're aiming at. Now, I know this was completely necessary, and I couldn't even imagine how they would work around it without just highlighting the body part, kind of like the system found in Eternal Darkness. But to be honest, these big bright reticles just feel right on the console.
Hey, stop! Are you crazy?
Like I said before, 98% of the Dreamcast library has this big colorful arcade feel to them visually, so I think I can give a pass here for nostalgia's sake. The last, and in my opinion most interesting addition to the genre is the scanner thing you get early on in the game. This handy piece of tech is brought up by the B button, and unlike the crappy scanning mechanic in RE Revelations, plays into the game world really fluidly. This thing serves a bunch of purposes and actually gets a pretty convincing in-game explanation. Throughout the Heimdall are scattered survivors of the Ark outbreak, and saving these guys will get you info, healing items, and ammo. But mixed in with these survivors are Ark-infected creatures posing as regular humans. Getting near these assholes will result in a bit of lost life, but pulling out the old trusty BMT3 scope will let us know who's human and who needs 9mm brain surgery. There are also invisible enemies that require the scope to see, along with doors and items hidden behind all the ship's new plant life. Given this cool feature and the nice additions of limb-based damage and fucking explosives, I'd say Carrier is a cool little entry into the survival horror history books. Now don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near perfect. It does suffer from really awkward controls in combat, but this often comes when a developer attempts to emulate RE without fully understanding how it works. I will also say the end of the game seemed to drag on forever, but when it's all said and done, there just aren't enough games in this genre to be too picky. Those of you interested in these types of games really owe it to yourself to check Carrier out and see what happens when a developer trips and falls into making a pretty interesting RE clone. But understandably, the faults here will likely be more than enough to keep away any people not already familiar with the blueprints laid out by late 90s Capcom. Without a doubt, this is a flawed little footnote in a failed console's history, but it's one that delivers some really interesting gameplay and a new twist on a genre that could use a few more games with this kind of ambition, earning it a score of 4 Wesker clones out of 5.
Is everything okay?
It's nothing. Lieutenant Manning and I were just discussing our duties. Isn't that right, Lieutenant?
Yes, that's right.
Try this one on for size, you damn monster!
If you're a fan of the Dreamcast, you probably already know this, but for those of you who didn't grow up with Sega's little white box, this platform typically came with a very identifiable look. Maybe you could call them repeating design motifs. Among these are bright colors, simple geometry, and a very noticeable dithering pattern that came from a pretty low color depth baked into the hardware. In fact, one of the few games that didn't share this look while not being a port from another console is the game most often compared to Carrier, Resident Evil Code Veronica. And that's a convenient segue, as this game looks like a nice blend of CV's dark, more detailed look and the more typical style of your average Dreamcast game. Even though your environment is mostly the dark, dingy insides of a military ship, there are flashes of bright color here and there, mostly in Jack and the plants that grow from the Ark organism. But other than the console-specific stuff, I'd say Carrier looks about like what you would expect from a game with such a smallish budget. On the surface, everything seems fairly kind of polished, but when the game's in motion, the little cracks start to become pretty evident. For instance, the animations for running and taking damage are pretty convincing, but they seem to be playing in slow motion, kind of like the devs put a little too many frames of animation into each action, which oddly enough leads me into a pretty high point of praise. Carrier runs at double the frame rate found in your typical Resident Evil game. At a pretty consistent 60 frames per second, this little Dreamcast title immediately feels different from the games it's trying to emulate, which is a very good thing. Of course, you are going to find pockets of slowdown, especially when using the scope, but smooth gameplay like this is always appreciated in a survival horror type game. And back to the downsides. So you probably already noticed how poor facial animations are, but for the so bad it's good camp out there, I'm happy to say lip syncing is also a mess. Throughout the entire game, I don't think any dialogue ever lined up with the game's actual animations, which coupled with the poor quality of the voice acting, makes for a very enjoyable time.
Lieutenant Manning, what is that?
It's nothing. It's just part of my stuff. Who's in the picture?
This?
Enemies are relatively interesting looking with their plant-based designs, but their stiff animations and kind of awkward ways of moving kind of take away from the appeal. I will say though, the best graphical feature is how well the environments look. Sure, they may be a little samey, but for the Dreamcast, they're pretty damn convincing. I also really liked how well the game handles very low light levels. Through the entire game, you're always just on the verge of not being able to see too far in front of you, but always able to make out your close surroundings. Which sounds like a given, but achieving a game that was creepy and dark while being well lit enough to actually enjoy was often an issue in full 3D games of the era. Now, of course, everything I just said goes out the window when you find the ship's scattered survivors. These guys all look terribly rushed in their design and animate like something out of Zombie Revenge, but somehow even worse.
Here, take this! A man with golden eyes said to give it to you.
Overall, I'd say Carrier is very obviously a budget game, but it does tread into AAA territory every once in a while. Obviously, the game's direct competitor, RE, was never a head-turner, technically speaking, with its primitive 2D backgrounds and low-poly characters, but it was the artistry that really set Resident Evil apart from the games that far outclassed it in sheer polygon-pushing terms. And if you ask me, that was what most games got wrong during this period in game design. So many devs were rushing to put out the next graphically stunning title, but it was the games that worked within the restraints of these systems and focused on an interesting art style or overall cohesive look that hold up well today. If I had to give some kind of letter grade to Carrier for graphical performance, it would probably be a C-. Sure, there are some really interesting things going on here, but there are plenty of badly designed or executed parts of the game that will break any immersion you might have developed along the way. That being said, can I really blame this game for looking so much like the rest of the Dreamcast library at the time? I guess that's for you to judge. Maybe those of you who really enjoy the console's very specific look will get a kick out of seeing it applied to a horror game, but if you don't spend your time admiring retro 3D graphics, I doubt very seriously you'll be able to keep a straight face while playing Carrier, which probably makes it all the more enjoyable if you're in it for the cheese, which, to be fair, you probably should be. Alright, so there's another Dreamcast survival horror game in the books. Obviously, I was pretty mixed up here. On one hand, I really appreciate seeing a game take a crack at the genre while staying both faithful to it and innovating in a few very cool ways. But either a low budget or lack of artistic skill makes Carrier feel like a roller coaster with the amount of ups and downs to be found. And speaking of which, let's take a look at the game's pros and cons to see if you need to be booking a cruise on the SS Heimdall anytime soon. Right from the start, it's nice to see my favorite genre getting the love it deserves. Sure, it may not be the best ambassador to the masses, but let's face it, we fans aren't exactly drowning in other options at the moment. And that's another boat joke. Boom, add that to the list. I still really like the look that was common to most Dreamcast games, and any day I get to see a new spin on it is a good day in my book. Listen, there's no way of getting around this. Carrier is mostly terrible, but it's a kind of terrible that begs to be experienced. The same way people across the world have enjoyed Tommy Wiseau's The Room, I assume you'll get a kick out of the batshit insanity around every corner here. Okay, so I struggled with this because if I tried hard enough, I could list a nearly infinite amount of flaws with this game, but many of those flaws might also be things that people tend to enjoy, like world-class bad voice acting, hilariously janky design, and monsters that look like they were lifted straight from an 80s B-movie. So I've only got one entry here, but that's not because the game is without issues. More than anything, it's because there are simply too many to count. Alright, so this is going to be a very complicated recommendation. I do think you guys should give this game a try, but only under two very specific circumstances. First being if you're hard up for survival horror games. While there's a thick wrapping of awful covering this whole game, there is a tiny seed of classic survival horror game design that makes Carrier an absolute joy to play even when it's at its worst. Second is for those of you who love a good train wreck. This game is filled with so many terribly funny moments, it's impossible to talk about all of them and not end up with a video longer than anyone would be willing to watch. So if you're down for a little cringe and a lot of laughs, bust out the old Dreamcast and get ready for quite possibly the most entertainingly cheesy game ever made. Sadly, complete copies of Carrier do seem to be rising in price lately on the used market, but hey, the Dreamcast wasn't the most pirated console in history for nothing, so you really have no excuse not to just at least give it a try. Well guys, I think that's about all the unintentional comedy I can take in one day, but don't worry, I will be back soon. So as usual, I'm Jared,
Colonel!
and this is Avalanche Reviews. What's poppin', fellow young people? Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you fancy yourself a bit of a survival horror connoisseur, I'll link some cool shit here on screen, and if you like what you see here, maybe think about supporting this content on Patreon. Just $1 a month gets you access to these videos weeks before anyone else, and a shot at controlling what I cover next. Well, that's it for now. I honestly hope you guys are having a good day, and I will most definitely see you next time.